Poverty, hunger, disease, there are all of these incredible problems throughout the world. Maybe there's just one thing, though, that has an aspect of impact on all of them. And we're going to be talking with Dwight Gee, who's the Executive Vice President of the World Justice Project. But first, we need to go to this video right now.
We are being tested by events and by the times. The need for justice has never been greater. Every person on this planet deserves a fair shake. And far too many of them live in communities without justice and therefore without hope. That's intolerable. Communities of opportunity and equity, that is what we seek. The rule of law is the predicate for the eradication of poverty, violence, corruption, pandemics, and other threats to civil society. It is the engine of justice.
Dwight, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Is that actually true? Is the rule of law the predicate for all of the ills?
Yes, it is. And it's very interesting to think about hunger, to think about poverty, to think about health conditions. And one of the things I think we don't bear as well in mind here in the United States, some of us don't anyway, is how much our lives and the success of our lives depend on an underlying foundation of the rule of law. So when you think about hunger for a minute, many of us contribute to all kinds of wonderful nonprofits that provide foodstuffs to people overseas. If that food is shipped there and it never makes it off the dock because somebody has stolen it so that they can sell it instead of delivering it forward, or the supply lines are not in place, that food isn't going to solve any problems. And we run into this all the time when there are famines, and they're almost unreachable to solve because there's so much corruption surrounding the distribution system for the supplies. That's just one instance of how the rule of law has to do with poverty.
Let's talk about the World Justice Project.
Certainly.
You're the Executive Vice President. Tell us what it is.
Yes, I would like to talk a little bit about this in terms of the way it came into existence. We saw at the beginning here a short clip with Bill Newcomb, our founder, speaking. He was formerly the lead attorney for Microsoft for about 25 years, and in that role, he traveled the world a lot. And everywhere he went, he could see these horrific problems that countries were facing and people were facing. And he could see, knowing that he was coming at it from the rule of law, he could see that without the foundation of the rule of law, these problems were simply intractable, whether it was public health or whether it was buildings that collapsed in an earthquake or whether it had to do with trying to start a business that would pay living wage jobs. All those things really rest on a foundation of the rule of law. So he became the president of the American Bar Association, and as his presidential initiative, he founded the World Justice Project to create, as he says, communities of opportunity and equity around the world through advancing the rule of law. So that is the mission of this organization, is not to advance the rule of law for law's sake, but rather because it's fundamental to the success of people's lives anywhere in the world, including here. And we have plenty of problems in the United States as well.
We're going to be getting the website up often, but it's the World Justice or worldjusticeproject.org. Strongly encourage you to go to the website because there is so much that, I mean, I used to practice law and I learned an awful lot just from going on the website itself. Seriously, I didn't realize the incredible impact that the rule of law has. And you're not a lawyer yourself,
no,
are you?
I am not.
How do you approach somebody who is hungry, who doesn't have a job, who has disease, everywhere around them? How do you approach someone like that and say, you need the rule of law?
Yes. We work globally with partners in many, many countries who are NGOs or they're representatives of government or they're other individuals or leaders in their communities, and identify issues that are most important to them and then try to foster programs that are going to help advance solutions. And if I may, I can give an example here that has to do with gender rights. In Sierra Leone, there's a group called Sierra Leone 50-50, and one of the initial goals was to try to come up with 50% representation in their legislative body of women and 50% men. And they worked very hard, and they got some laws passed there to protect the rights of women with respect to marriage, property ownership, and protection from violence. And that was great, but the law was written only in one language, and there are 4 official languages in Sierra Leone. So the women who lived, the people who lived in the largest city could know about the law. Anybody outside of the city wouldn't know because they didn't speak that language. So we worked with them, simple matter of translating the laws into the other 3 languages, and then worked with people who could broadcast those laws in simple language to people across the country so women would know that they had those rights. So these were women who have very fundamental issues of being abused, of if they were divorced, just thrown out on their ear, of not having any rights within the marriage. So very fundamental things. And that was how we successfully dealt with that by working with that local partner.
Wow, that's amazing though, because you're talking, you use the word fundamental,
Yeah.
But that's fundamental to a culture for such a long period of time. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, rape and violence against women has not just been tolerated, but it's almost been expected. And how can the rule of law go into a place like that and change things? Because I understand that it is.
Yeah, and there again, we work with, find local partners who understand the importance of these issues, and it's very grassroots. So, the rule of law can sound very academic and esoteric, but the application of it and how people experience that is primary and fundamental. So it's shining a light, and one of the things that I'd like to talk about a second is the rule of law index that we produce.
We're going to get to that. It's very, very interesting.
So we are with that able to identify some fundamental things, find partners who can help us out with advancing the kinds of laws that are needed and promulgating those and shining a real light on that, so that when you shine a light on these problems, then they're much harder to avoid, and they can't be these dark secrets that happen.
We're talking with Dwight Gee, the Executive Vice President of the World Justice Project. Be sure to go to the website, worldjusticeproject.org. We're going to get it up on the web or on the screen many times throughout the show. Really very interesting about the incredible impact that the rule of law has and could have on all sorts of countries. Let's talk just a little bit about the impact of the rule of law on children in poverty. Now, I think of someone in poverty, especially a child that's a poor person. The rule of law just has absolutely no application to them at all.
No application, you would think. However, again, using as an example here, the slums of India are a place where, of course, the poverty is really wrenching, and particularly for children. And one of the government there had put into place some policies that would provide some better health care and better nutrition and better education for everybody living there. But the first thing they had to have, which seems very simple, but the first thing they had to have was a kind of an identity card so that they could take advantage of these services, because without that, they didn't really have any formal existence in front of the eyes of the authorities. So again, we worked with an NGO in the slums of Delhi called the Public Health Foundation of India, and simply started educating people on how they could get this card. And once they did, then they had rights to go to the public health clinics and get the services they need, better wells and cleaner drinking water. They were able to do a lot of advocacy to promote greater opportunities for them with all of these things. But without that structure of the rule of law in place, there wasn't any chance. And you could put all the aid there you wanted, and if it's not going to get to the right people because of corruption, which is rampant in India, as we know, and many places, then there's no help.
So that's all it took for a little kid in poverty to be able to say, I have rights, I have this card?
I've got a card. And so
Really?
then they could start tapping in those things. And does that make them wealthy? Does it? No, but it provides a fundamental level of support for them that they didn't have otherwise.
We've talked a little bit about women and the rule of
Yes.
law, but the impact of, there's an economist out of Peru, Hernando de Soto, who has written for years about property rights, particularly for women.
Yes.
Is that something that you do?
We work on that. Yes, we've worked on that for in quite a number of places, and for women and for people in general. We have we worked in a project in Haiti where local farmers had no rights to the land, so they could farm the land and then just be shoved aside and lose their livelihood and all the investment that they'd made in that property. So again, we worked with a local non-governmental organization to educate the farmers about property ownership, and got maps of what ownership they had of property, and so that they were able to hold on to that land and move forward. And that works for farmers, men and women. It's a particular issue with women in many countries where there's not equal rights for them with men. And again, we focus on solving those problems at that level.
We live in the western part of the United States, which, growing up, people said, well, it's the wild, wild west.
Yeah.
But really, what they were talking about was a lawless society.
Yes.
And that sounds like that's what you're talking about here. Lawless societies that with laws, things change.
And there's, as with everything in the world, the lawlessness is on sort of a curve. There are, some countries where the rule of law is extraordinarily weak, and it's a wild, wild west and chaotic, and they're in the news all the time, so we hear about them. Then there are some at the far end, like the Norwegian countries, Scandinavian countries that have a very high rule of law, and then a lot in the middle. And it's interesting, and I think important to note, that while the U.S. here does a very good job on quite a number of things, we fall down in some areas pretty badly, and that is in terms of providing access to justice. And if you happen to be poor, and if you happen to be not part of the dominant ethnic group in this country, you've heard the term driving while black. That is that there is prejudice against different populations, and if you don't have money, can you afford an attorney to represent you in whatever case? Can you advance your rights? And the answer is no. It's very hard. So that's a place where the United States doesn't do so well in providing a uniform access to justice to every part of the population. And if you're looking at a strong rule of law society, it is one where there is an equal opportunity for everyone to be protected under the law. And we do real well on some things. We don't do particularly well in that area.
Mm-hmm. Something else that you have worked on in the past is gender equity. How does the rule of law impact that?
First of all, are there the kinds of laws on the books that give equal rights for property ownership, for education, for health care, for protection from domestic violence in the country? And so we try to focus on where those things are deficient and come up with means of getting the laws on the books, getting them known, and providing access to the kind of legal help, whether that's a formal or informal system of justice, to make sure that women have an equal shake in the matter.
We probably have a stereotype of what a lawyer looks like
Yeah.
here in the United States. It's a man in a three-piece suit. It's a
Right.
woman very smartly dressed, who is, going to rip your eyeballs out if you say the wrong thing. Sorry about that, lawyers. But that's probably a stereotype. As you go around the world working with others, Is that the lawyer who helps?
That is a stereotype. And in our country, we have a system of judges and attorneys that we're all very familiar with. In many places in the world, they don't have systems like that, but they have systems that work very well. And it could be an informal, it could be tribal elders, it could be an informal justice system of some other kind. The key things about having a rule of law that function is that individuals would have a place to go to resolve a dispute, that they could turn to somebody who was independent and competent and fair-minded and is going to pay attention to both sides and help them come to some kind of a resolution. So the World Justice Project looks at all of those and doesn't say you need to adopt the wigs and robes and the court system that we know in the United States to do this. We look at all different kinds of justice. The main thing being, do people feel like they have some way to protect their rights and to resolve disputes and have that kind of equity in their country that they need?
We're talking with Dwight Gee, who's the Executive Vice President of the World Justice Project. And as with anything that you do, you have to be able to measure things.
Yes.
You've got, at the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I will, and it'll take just a moment here. It's a fascinating project here. One of the things we realized that we needed to do if we're going to advance the rule of law is to understand where it's functioning and where it isn't. You could just ask governments around the world how good their rule of law was, and you can imagine what kind of answers you would get. So we worked very hard with some really smart people to design a system that would give us impartial information that would really measure how well the rule of law is functioning or not functioning in different countries. So in 2011, we included 66 countries. This year, we'll be going to 100 countries. The way we pull the information together is through a couple of polls. One is a poll of experts, and those could be attorneys or the tribal elders or that we're talking about, or whomever is involved in the justice system. And we ask them a complicated set of things on how the rule of law is functioning and their perception of that. The other, we go straight to the people and do a general population poll. We hire polling companies in the countries we're measuring. And in some cases, these are telephone interviews. In some cases, the people aren't literate, so that they're just go and talk with these people where they meet them on the street. And we ask a long series of questions on how they perceive the rule of law to work. Might be, for instance, part of the questions are, have you had a dispute in the last 3 years? And if so, how did you attempt to remedy that? And we have a slate of things from, it was hopeless, I didn't do anything, to, I went to this tribunal or this court or whatever it was. And then we follow that down until we get to, was there a resolution or not? So on this matter. Or we ask questions about if the government wanted to come through and set a road here, would there be a process for compensating you for lost property? Would there be a public process involved? So we aggregate all of this information from the expert poll and from the general population poll and pull it together, and we're able to give really meaningful, statistically valid estimates of how well the rule of law is functioning on more than 50 different variables.
Really?
And we plot those on what's called a spider graph.
And we have some of those.
I think you have those.
Yeah, and thank you for making those available. By the way, they're on the website as well. But I wanted to ask you this question. And actually admire what you do, because by going to the people, you get the emotional side of their beliefs about their rights.
That's right.
And because if they don't think they have any rights, then they're chilled before they even get started. And so if you're even helping educating by asking questions, then you've taken some steps.
Yeah, we've taken some steps, but we would also, through the polling, know if they don't recognize that they have any rights, then that's something that we need to work on through what we call our mainstreaming program, and those projects that I've mentioned are part of that work.
Tell us about the spiders.
Yeah, the spiders are pretty interesting. And
Like the first one about accountable government is the first one that we're going to be showing up on the screen.
Great. So under accountable government, what we believe is in terms of having a working rule of law is that fundamentally you've got to have a government that's accountable and its officials, because if they're corrupt and stand in the way of the rule of law, then it's not going to work. So,
based on your research,
yes,
what surprised you about the responses there in terms of the accountable government?
that varies country by country, you know, and depending on how it works out. But there's a great variability of that in the northern European countries. The governments tend to be very accountable. In other parts of the world where rule of law is not functioning very well, you'll see that in the spider chart, the lines aiming towards the middle, which means they're not doing a good job, we can measure that as we go along.
I got to ask you, are you skewed towards democracies?
I think that the democracies probably there's a higher correlation with a rule of law in a democracy, because if you've got a, certainly if you go to the extreme of a dictatorship, then there's not an accountable government. The governmental leaders are not operating under the rule of law, so you don't have a functioning rule of law.
Then there's another part of the spider is security and fundamental rights, which, you know, that sounds pretty emotional. Opportunity there for the public to believe if they have fundamental rights.
And we do check, and yet we're working on the perceptions from the general population poll on whether people feel that they have the right of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and they have an equal treatment under the law. And so, yeah, I think this is pretty emotional, but when you compare these, if you read the news and you take a look at these spider charts, you'll say, yeah, that makes sense. That's what I would sort of expect that we would find.
Another part is open government and regulatory enforcement. And here in the United States, there are many, many people. In fact, we have open government laws all over the place, but there are still more and more of a call for transparency.
There is. And a fundamental thing here is how clear are the laws and how well are they known and how much do people understand?
Do you compare tax codes?
Tax codes, precisely. So, but if there's a lack of transparency on the way the laws are made, on the lack of distribution of the laws, publicizing the laws, that's a real problem that we find with having that open government, and if people don't know what's going on, and if it's an arbitrary enforcement.
You've already talked a little bit about access to justice, and I want to get back to enforcement in just a second, but is the access to justice issue, that seems to be a real basic one.
It is. And there's where, let's face it, in this country, certain of us have great access to justice. If we need to hire an attorney, we can do that, and we'll be heard, and we don't have to worry about getting good representation. If you don't have any money, then lawyers here are very expensive, and that's a huge problem. So getting access to the court system, if the courts are not funded well, or whatever kind of judicial system you have, if the courts are not funded well, then there's going to be a restricted access to justice as you go along. So several things can happen there in terms of not having enough government support for the judicial system so that it's accessible, and also just individually if you have a chance for representation.
I want to get back to enforcement. What level does enforcement play, or what role does enforcement play in your rule of law index?
Yes, and I think the fundamental thing here is whether people perceive that there's an equitable treatment by responsible and accountable and competent law enforcement. Is there a good means of administering justice or not? And if it's arbitrary or it's not transparent, then that enforcement is obviously not working well. So again, it's making sure that it's fair and equitable for everyone involved.
What are the countries that fare the best overall
in the best ones tend to be the far northern European ones, Norway and Sweden and the Scandinavian countries.
But if we look at the populations there,
yeah,
we look not particularly diverse.
Yeah.
What, I mean, and this may be beyond what you're doing, but does diversity have any kind of role in terms of your rule of law?
Well, I think it does in certain countries. There are also other countries that score pretty badly where there's not much diversity in the population. And there's be some African countries that would not have much diversity, but still a low rule of law. But then going back to the US, which I think we shouldn't forget, is that we have a real diversity in the populations here, and we don't necessarily have very equal treatment for all parts of the population. So there is probably a correlation.
So the World Justice Project does have an impact here in the United States.
Oh, we work in the United States quite a lot. We're very global, and we work with some education programs for high school students and with universities across the country to try to advance that, because this is an important component here as well.
If at the end of the day you've left work and you feel like you've had a successful day, what have you done?
I think the key thing is helping shine a bigger light on where the rule of law could help improve people's lives, and finding some hands-on ways of helping people in various countries to advance the rule of law so that there's going to be a greater sense of opportunity and equity for people.
And we only have about a minute and a half left, and I think actually this is the big question in all of this.
Yeah.
You really, in order to change things with the rule of law, you have to step on some really big political toes. How does the World Justice Project get through that morass?
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing. There are some wonderful organizations that will take on leaders directly. We rather hold up the information through the media directly to the governments of these countries and say, impartial poll, here's what we find. These are the deficiencies. You might want to look at this so you can figure out how to address these and make your country function better.
So organizations like the UN certainly are looking at your findings.
Oh, yes, and the UN looks at it. There are many, many, many organizations that seize on these findings and are pulling them forward. So it's providing this impartial information, which is, nobody else is doing this work. It's really a key tool for people.
20 seconds left. You got you're 5 years down the road. You're looking back. How'd you do?
This is a long road that we're on. This is a very ambitious project. If we can continue to raise the visibility, the importance of rule of law and what it means in people's lives, and get governments and leaders to think about ways that they can advance that, then we're making some real progress.
Thank you. That was Dwight Gee, the Executive Vice President of the World Justice Project. People who are working around the world to try to bring the rule of law so that everyone has access to justice and equal rights. Go to the website, worldjusticeproject.org. We'll see you right here next week.